Welcome to Road to Recovery.
Hello and welcome to Road to Recovery, advocacy and insights for trucking accidents with Sagi Shaked. Sagi is founder of Shaked Law Personal Injury Lawyers and is ranked as one of the top 100 trial lawyers in the United States by the American Trial Lawyers Association. With a wealth of experience in personal injury, wrongful death, and complex litigation cases, he passionately advocates for victims and has recovered multi-million-dollar settlements and damages for his clients. I am your host, Kevin Rosenquist, and I am excited to be here today with Sagi to talk about sort of a David and Goliath approach to the inside story of a particular trucking crash. Sagi, welcome. Great to have you.
Thanks for having me again, Kevin. Look forward to this topic today.
Yeah, we're talking about one specific case, which I don't think we've done before. Let's go ahead and dive in. It's Betty. Is it Batta?
Yeah, Betty Batta. Yeah.
Betty Batta versus FPL. Can you kind of introduce the case and just sort of talk about why it's significant and why you want to talk about it?
Yeah, absolutely. So this arises from a trucking accident. And Betty Batta was a passenger in a vehicle that her husband was driving. And FPL, for those that are not in Florida, or at least in the South Florida area, that's a Florida Power and Light. And basically, it's a truck, one of these big trucks that handles emergency outings. You know, when lights are out in a specific neighborhood, they'll send over what they call a trouble truck. And this big monstrous truck is out there and they're trying to fix the lighting in the neighborhood, get the lights back on. So they're working where the transformer is. So that's kind of the setting that we're talking about. Power's out in the neighborhood. And the parties that we're dealing with is Betty, who's the injured person in the passenger seat, her husband, Charles. And then you have Florida Power and Light and their driver of their truck. So that's kind of the parties involved in the case.
And what makes this particular one significant?
To understand this case, you really have to understand the trucking rules and regulations. Now, we've talked about them in the past on prior episodes on why you really need to have an understanding for each of these regulations, the federal regulations and in this case, the state regulations, which would be Florida. So what happened is this is a case where the power was out in a place called Leisureville in Florida, which is in Palm Beach County. And as the power is out, the residents are calling Florida Power and Light to come out there and fix it. And so when the Florida Power and Light trouble truck reaches the area where they need to fix, that entire neighborhood, mainly made up of retirees, has their power out. So the trouble truck is on the roadway and the transformer is in back of one of the homes. So as the trouble truck is there, it puts on its lights. So they have hazard lights on, and then there's strobe lights on that you would see on top of a truck. So the strobe lights are working, the hazard lights are working, and their driver, his name was Daryl Spinks, he gets out of the trouble truck and walks over to the back of one of the homes where the transformer is. And he starts to work on the transformer to try to get the lights back on, or at least report to Florida Power and Light what's going on. And as he's doing this, my client, who again is the passenger, is driving with her husband. Her husband's driving, and they make the turn on the roadway where the trouble truck is. And as they're driving, the husband, while he sees this truck, he sees the hazards on and he sees the strobe lights on, he thinks that that truck is moving. And in reality, the truck is not moving, it's stationary. And he ends up smashing right into the back of the truck. And so this case, depending on how you frame the case, if you're FPL, you frame it as, hey, Mr. Batta just slammed into a truck that's standing still. Why didn't he see it? Or if you're the person who's representing Mr. Batta and Mrs. Batta, which would be myself and Joel Roth from my office, the frame was a little different. You know, they violated the federal motor carrier safety regulations and the state regulations by failing to put out the required warning devices, because the way the law works is when they created this law to put out the warning devices at 10 feet, 100 feet, and 200 feet, they created that law based on the understanding that people would think these trucks are moving. So what Charles Batta thought when he ran into the back of this truck is what everyone else would think. And so that's why they have those warning devices out there to prevent incidents like this one. And this all came about, if you understood the trucking regulations, you knew this wasn't a regular rear end collision. this was a rear-end collision because the Florida Power and Light and their truck didn't do what was required by Florida law.
And when you say the hazard, are you talking about those little lights that trucks will put on the side of the road, the little things on the ground?
Right. You see them there. They have a couple of different options on what they can put. So they can put flares. They look like fireworks, I guess. They would put them at 10 feet, 100 feet, and 200 feet. Or they can put you've seen the triangles with the reflectors on them. Yeah. So the triangles with the reflectors on, those are some of the requirements. You can do one or the other. Cones, they did have cones on their truck. Now, that doesn't fall with compliance with the federal motor carrier safety regulations. But had they put them up, at least it would have been some sort of warning. That and the reflective triangles or the flares, do something to warn the motoring public. That's what they should have done. But they didn't, obviously. Yeah,
it just kind of makes you go, hey, I should probably slow down because something's going on. I don't know what it is yet, but I should probably slow down. Yeah, makes sense. So can you talk a little bit about, what happened to Betty Batta, what her injuries were like, what the circumstances of the accident were?
Yeah. So what happened was, as Mr. Batta turns onto the roadway, here's another unique little angle to the case that obviously didn't help us. So Mr. Batta had previous eye procedures to his eye. He was blind in one eye, legally blind in one eye. Driving down the roadway, has had several surgeries on his eye. And as he's driving down the roadway, he smashes into this truck, this Florida Power and Light trouble truck on the roadway. So part of their defense was, he shouldn't have been driving. He shouldn't have been on the road. He's 89 years old. Why is he even in a car at the time? So some of the defenses that we faced were, hey, he's old. While it's not a defense, it might resonate with some people. It didn't in this case, but it might have. Another defense that we dealt with was he's had so many eye procedures in the past. He's legally blind in one eye. Why is he even driving? He shouldn't be driving. And so those were two of the defenses. And now Betty, she's in the passenger seat. She didn't do anything wrong or couldn't be blamed for doing anything wrong. Betty is a very sweet elderly lady. She was small and petite. So when she was in the front passenger seat of their car, it was an older car. I think it was in the late 1980s, her car. And as she raised her hand, she saw this coming. And as she raised her hand, the airbags came out. Now you can imagine if you hold your hands up like I'm doing now, and the airbags come off, and the left hand from the wrist, from above right where your wrist ties into your arm, just flew off into the back seat. So it was a traumatic amputation.
Oh my gosh.
Right. They say you shouldn't put smaller people in the front, and that's probably why. But that was what the injury was to Betty, on top of all the psychological injuries. She had a traumatic amputation of her left hand. So that's the injuries, and those were some of the defenses that we were dealing with in this case.
Wow, that's awful. Can you kind of outline some of those key legal issues? Was it negligence, duty of care, liability? Can you kind of talk about what exactly the claims were?
So when we filed the lawsuit, FPL took the position, like I said at the beginning, is that, hey, we're not responsible. You rear-ended us. When we finally got an offer, it was a negligible offer. It wasn't even $10,000. It was less than that. So we really didn't have a choice but to try the case because they didn't understand the law. And I truly believe that's what happened. The law is in place to protect the public, right? And so if you're a huge corporation like Florida Power and Light, and just to give you some perspective, their CEO made $30 million that year. So just to tell you how big this company is, just a little company, right? So when you have these huge companies and they're not following the law, obviously someone's going to get hurt. And then there's repercussions to that. So here, this case went back to what we call is a training case. It was a negligent training type of case. Why do I mean that? It wasn't the driver. The driver was doing what FPL, Florida Power and Light, taught him. They taught him, hey, you're on the roadway. You got the trouble truck. Go to the back of that house, put your strobe lights on, put your hazards on, go to the back of the house or wherever the transformer is, work on it, fix it, report to us, and everything's going to be okay. And what they didn't train him on from the day he got hired till the moment of this crash, he was never trained on those state rules and those federal rules that require you to put out those warning devices, the flares or the reflective triangles. They never did that. And so we didn't want to blame the Florida Power and Light technician / driver because it really wasn't his fault that he wasn't trained on it. And so the case went to Florida Power and Light's negligent training of their driver, of their technician. And that's really how we frame that case. Now, this case is all closed at this point, so I can talk about this kind of stuff. But so that's what our case was. And I don't believe they understood it. They didn't understand it when we filed the lawsuit. If they didn't understand, when I say they, I mean Florida Power and Light, they didn't understand the law, and neither did the driver, Mr. Spinks, when I took his deposition years before the trial. And I asked him, how long were you supposed to be out there? He says anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes. And when I say how long are you supposed to be out there, we're talking about the working on the transformer. He said it takes me about 15 to 20 minutes to check the transformer. And I asked him this like 6 different times because I knew what the law said. The law says as soon as possible and in no case later than 10 minutes. Right? So like, for example, let's say you have a school bus. School bus stops on the roadway. They pick up the children and they move on. You're not going to put warning signs behind the school bus, but they clearly, Florida Power and Light clearly wasn't acting like a school bus or like a FedEx driver, right? You see FedEx or UPS stop on the roadway. They're not putting out warning devices. They're just delivering a package and moving on. Same thing with Amazon. Here, the FPL driver, the employee, was out there for 15 to 20 minutes because that's what FPL wanted him to do. And so when he's out there for 15 to 20 minutes, he should have put out those warning devices. And he didn't. And as a result, this crash occurs. And that's where this case started from. So when I took his deposition, he said 15 to 20 minutes about 6 times. And every deposition we take, we record by video. So if we come to trial and the case cannot settle and we're at trial and someone tries to change their testimony like they did in this case. In this case, when we had the trial, our very first witness right off the bat was the defendant driver, the employee, Mr. Spinks. And one of the questions was, and it takes you about 15 to 20 minutes to check one of these transformers, right? Because I was trying to lay out the groundwork that you need to put these warning devices out. And of course, in trial, he said, no, it only takes me 2 to 3 minutes. Well, if it took you 2 to 3 minutes, why didn't you tell us that 3 years earlier when we took your deposition? And then I went through the whole impeachment process, but I played that video clip, which showed him saying it 5 different times that it takes him 15 to 20 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes. So that made him look like a liar, made FPL look like liars. Like now they're trying to change all the facts of the case. And the jury just didn't buy it.
They coached him to say something.
Correct. When they figured out what the law was, they were like, oh, shoot, now we got to change our wording and let's make sure that he says he followed the law. But a little too late when you swore under oath 3 years earlier that it took you 15 to 20 minutes. So that really hurt them. So one of the issues in the case was, did they have a duty to warn other people on the roadway? So the law, again, that Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulation, one of the regulations is that you have to put out those warning devices, and they surely had a duty. And then the next step would be, did they breach that duty, meaning did they violate it? And they did. And did it cause injuries? And in this case, it did cause injuries and they violated it. And then, there were experts involved. And that's why I always talk about, you got to get your experts involved from day one on these cases. We'll talk about that as well.
Were there any other dramatic turning points and kind of like big moments in the trial?
Yeah. So in the trial, I think we had a couple of great moments. Yeah, 2 that come to mind that are really amazing moments in the trial. One deals with an accident reconstruction expert, where our accident reconstruction expert, obviously we went to the scene, we recreated the scene. Their accident reconstruction expert was there as well. But, when their accident reconstruction expert testified, he was so sure of his opinions, because normally they testify within a reasonable degree of probability or engineering probability. This guy, he said 100%, this is how the crash occurred. And there is no doubt that Mr. Batta, the driver of the car, is at fault. I know for a fact this is how it happened. And so in Florida, the jury gets to take notes, and they also get to ask questions after the attorneys ask their questions. And one of the jurors in this case wrote down a very interesting question. She wrote down this question. So they write this question down, and I'll tell you what it is in a second. The judge gets all the papers. They fold them in half, so you don't know which juror asked the question. And they look at all the questions, and then we have what's called a sidebar, where the attorneys go and speak to the judge. The jury can't hear it. The judge reads each question, and then each side gets to argue if they don't want it or they do want that question. Of course, this question, which I'll tell you what it is right now, we wanted it. The defense didn't want it. The question is, how are you? So this is the juror question. How are you so certain and 100% certain that it happened the way you say it happened? What do you have, a time machine? And so when the juror asked that, I started smiling like you're smiling now. And I'm like, I knew it's destruction for them. So of course they objected and we couldn't ask that question. The judge didn't ask the question of the defense expert witness, but I can bet you that I made sure to bring up that question in closing argument. As you know, to say like, who does he think he is? What does he think he has? He has a time machine? And I'm looking at all the jurors, and then everyone's smiling because they knew that was the question they wanted to ask. And so that was a great moment in the trial. And I think it was a game changer for us. And then the other moment in trial was more of a sad kind of moment, because when we were preparing for trial, I had gone to Charlie and I call him Charlie, it's Charles Batta and Betty Batta's house. And we went and we talked to them, the attorneys in the office. We talked to them and we prepared them for the trial. And, some of the stuff he said, what we talked about, some we didn't, because that's just prep. And so when he was on the stand, I started asking him some questions. And one of the questions I asked him, because we wanted to talk about what her life is after the amputation. How does she deal? What is her life like? So he talks about, he dresses her. She can't put on her bra. He has to help her do everything. And then I asked him, well, what about friends? Do you have any friends, Charlie, that you hang around with? And he said, not really. I go, what do you mean? He says, well, they're all in the warehouse. And I'm like, what do you mean warehouse, Charlie? And so before he answers the question, let me give you what's going on in my mind. As he's telling me this, I'm going back to, we're in the house preparing, and he's telling me that back in the 40s, remember, he's 89 years old. Back in the 40s, his brother was involved somehow, some way with the underground world, mafia or something like that. And I don't know whether to believe it or not, but so all I'm thinking is, they're all in the warehouse. I'm like, when he's telling me this, I'm like, please don't tell me something like this, right? So this is what he said. Again, I don't know the truth of it or not. So long story short, he's telling me this. I'm go, what do you mean they're in the warehouse? And he goes, you guys call them nursing homes. I call them warehouses. I guess all his friends are older and they're in nursing homes, and he calls them warehouses. So that was a funny moment. People were laughing. And then not too long after that, we started talking about what happened. And he talked about how the crash occurred. And then he talked about what happened afterwards. And then when he talks about what happened afterwards, he gets out of the car. He circles. He's the driver. So he circles around the back where the trunk is, go all the way to the front, because he couldn't circle from the front. Remember, the car was stuck into the trouble truck. So he circled around it, and the whole car is full of blood. And as he's looking, and he uses his hand motion like this, where he's putting his hand trying to get in. All he does is he's like speechless. He's just using his hand motion, and you can see that the man wants to cry. And he's like, I was looking, and he just can't explain himself that, he saw her wrist in the back seat, and it was blood everywhere, and he was crying, and the jury's crying, and the judge is tearing. And it was just like a really emotional moment for the trial. So I think those three kind of moments were what I think were some of the key moments in the case that were memorable to me, at least, and I think to the jury.
So let's finish up with this. What was the outcome?
So the outcome on that case is 100% responsibility on the part of Florida Power and Light, 0% on Charlie, and obviously 0 on Betty Batta. They were responsible. Both sides had accident reconstruction experts. Both sides had human factors experts, because this happened at nighttime, to talk about lighting, perception reaction time. It was an interesting dynamic on how everything we talk about in these trucking cases, how you need to do from the beginning, all played out in this trial. So yeah, it was $1.2 million. We tried this case back in 2000, I want to say 2015, I think it was when we tried this case. About 10 years ago is when this case was tried in Palm Beach County.
Wow. That's a pretty wild story. pretty awful.
Yeah.
I can't imagine. I'm trying to imagine, like, put myself in Charlie's shoes of like seeing my wife's hand in the back seat. Oh, that's and all the blood. That's devastating.
Yeah, that's when you saw people, tearing. He was able to make the jury laugh, from the warehouse comment and all the other comments. He was just a funny guy. And then he went into serious mode with the, making them cry, which is, if you can do that, and this wasn't like scripted or anything like that. It just happened naturally, sort of like we're doing this conversation. It was just like a natural flow of the way it happens. And you get those memorable moments in the trial that can make a difference.
Wow. Well, crazy story indeed. Glad it worked out for them. At least it financially worked out for them. But thank you for sharing that. And thank you for tuning in to Road to Recovery, advocacy for and insights for trucking accidents with Sagi Shaked. For more information or to connect with Sagi, visit shakedlaw.com. And don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel and leave us a review. Sagi, always great to see you. Thanks so much for sharing that.
Thanks for having me, Kevin.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.